Hey, AP kids, what's shaking? Hey, I wanted to take a couple minutes and recap chapter 38 for you. I know we started some of this before we went on school closure, but I think it's important that I kind of give main ideas of that chapter as we go ahead, so that maybe I can plant some significance to the chapter, and we can use it going forward. First of all, I think it's important for us to remember that before the outbreak of World War II, in late 1930s or so, this is before Germany invades Poland, which is in 1939, September 1st. The United States was fiercely isolationist. Remember, the United States does not join the League of Nations, walks away from that, severely weakening the League. And by 1940, however, in the Battle of Britain, where Hitler is attempting to bomb the British into submission, President Roosevelt realizes and recognizes very quickly, by now France had surrendered after 6 weeks, that Britain needs help, that it's the only hope of Western governments and democracies in Europe in the face of the German onslaught. So Roosevelt begins the Lend-Lease Act. Now, this has to circumvent Congress. Congress is doing everything it can to impede the United States' involvement in getting into another European war. So what happens is the United States and Roosevelt is able to negotiate a way around Congress here, sending old World War I era destroyers to Britain to help them against the U-boat attacks against merchant fleets, sending food supplies, military supplies to the British. In return, the British are going to allow the United States to have some access to islands in the Pacific, which the United States will use against the threat of the Japanese eventually. Italy, Germany, and the Soviet Union are all becoming involved in the Spanish Civil War now. Fascism is going to raise its ugly head in Spain as well, and Franco will lead a fascist revolution against the nationalists. There, Hitler and Mussolini will take advantage of the Spanish Civil War to practice their military, to practice their dive bombings against the Basque people in particular in the Spanish Civil War. And this provides military training for the Germans and the Italians, which they're going to use very quickly. Now, the Soviet Union was already involved fighting an undeclared war against the Japanese in Mongolia. You remember, the Japanese are going to invade Manchuria. They'll do this, and they'll make their 21 demands of China. And the League of Nations does nothing. They're writing a strongly worded letter to the Japanese to get them out of Manchuria. The Japanese will then stage an incident at Mukden to invade the capital of Nanking, and of course move on to their horrible attacks on the Chinese people there, the rape of Nanking. Meanwhile, Stalin and Hitler signed the non-aggression treaty, non-aggression pact, and Poland is invaded in September of 1939. The Soviets will invade a few months later from the east, and Poland will cease to exist. This does buy Stalin some time to build his military up. Stalin, don't get the wrong idea, Stalin knows all along that Hitler hates communism, and that Hitler's armies are coming his way eventually. Now, we do see intense resistance to German, Italian, and Japanese invasions. The Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto are a particular good example of resistance against the Nazi oppressions. Ethiopian resistance to Italian invasions in and around 1937, 1938. The Ethiopians fight diligently against the Italians. The Chinese will employ guerrilla warfare against the Japanese as they attack into Manchuria and then into Nanking. And we can't forget about the Free French movement. Remember that France will surrender in just 6 weeks, and France will be divided into an occupied territory to the north and Vichy France to the south. Which is really a puppet government of the Nazis. And all along during the war, the Free French movement is active, and Charles de Gaulle is one of the leaders of this French resistance. So we see active resistance during this time. What swayed the war in the Allies' favor was the industrial capacity of the United States and the Soviet Union. Though that's the key, that the United States was able to fight a two-front war, all the while being able to outproduce Germany and the Axis powers multifold. Then the Soviet Union also had the brunt of the full German armies against it, and was able to manufacture enough tanks and planes and the like. For the United States, that the big key was our shipping, able to make transport ships and aircraft carriers and airplanes, just unbelievable amount of industrial capacity, and it's going to sway the tide of war in the favor of the United States and the Allies. World War II was a war of mobility. Here you're going to have to recognize the name Blitzkrieg. The Japanese will also use it with their aircraft carriers, with surprise attacks, particularly at Pearl Harbor, and across the Philippines, in Singapore as well. So fast attack is the main idea of World War II, as opposed to World War I's aggression. Stalemate. That's the word I'm looking for. It took me a few seconds there. Technology is really important to World War II. We see that in the field of code breaking. The Allies, particularly the United States, is able to break the Japanese code prior to the attack at Midway Island, and the British are able to crack the German code. And so this shows just how important technology was. Let's see. World War II was a total war. Now here we're going to see the bombing of cities and towns and innocent population centers and industrial sites. There really were no innocents in World War II. The idea here was and Hitler employed it over Britain to bomb the will out of people. The British were able to withstand that. The United States will employ it, and the British will, against German cities. And the United States will definitely employ bombing of Tokyo, in particular with fire bombs that will rain devastation down upon the Japanese people to break their will. It will take 2 atomic bombs in late August of August of 1945 to finally get the Japanese to surrender. Women did receive long-term opportunities here, which we did not see following World War I. Remember that as men returned from war in World War I, women were forced and relegated back to their traditional roles. We don't see that in World War II. Instead, we see many more businesses and companies and factories and opportunities for women that will stay on. The United States does force the resettlement of Japanese to resettlement camps on the Pacific coast. President Roosevelt will order that, and so we see a forced migration of Japanese into resettlement camps further inland. Unfortunately, the Japanese will lose their homes and businesses. Sort of a sad time for those on the West Coast, I should say. The Holocaust, we have to wrap our brains around this. This was the attempt by the Germans, by the Nazis, to near extinction or to destroy European Jews by Germany. It's an example of genocide. There are others that we should not overlook. We have the Armenian, the Assyrian genocide, the Mai, the Holodomor that Stalin carried out against his own Ukrainian people. That's where my family has some history there. So these are examples of genocides or democides, depending on a demographic that are being targeted. So why do these happen within this particular time frame? Within these about 50 years or so? Well, really, it has to do a lot with modern media and with propaganda. There we're seeing information being disseminated like never before, and we see then the uptick of these horrible genocides, and we should always keep our eyes open for when people become vulnerable and become targets. Let's see. The Cold War is going to break out very quickly. We move from the United States and the Soviet Union being allies against a common enemy to now differences are being very distinct, and that's capitalism and democracy versus communism. The communists would limit who should vote in their form of democracy. So they are only choosing some to vote, and those would be Communist Party those that would lean to the Communist Party are part of the Soviet, and so they continue their ongoing power. Let's see. The Soviets, and particularly Stalin, were very suspicious of the Allies. That it took until June of 1944 to open a second front against Hitler's armies, and that was in France. Now, the United States does attack into Italy, into Anzio, and works their way up through Italy, but still that does not relieve Stalin and the Russians, or I should say the Soviets, from the brunt of the German onslaught. And so the notion for Stalin was, hey, the Western governments are just having the communists and the Nazis kill each other, and they are not coming to help. And so this does build suspicion, and unfortunately we see the tide of the Cold War being developed even before the war ends. In addition, the Allies did support the Free Polish government in exile. Now, the Polish government exile was anti-communist, and the Allies wished to put Poland back in its rightful position, and that's not what Stalin wanted whatsoever. Stalin promised that each of the eastern states that his armies rolled across in conquering or moving all the way to Berlin would receive free elections. That never happened, or they were staged. And so we see that we see a building Red Scare in the United States. We see it in France. We see anti-communist efforts. The Marshall Plan, we studied this, was an attempt to rebuild Western Europe, to stem the tide of communism. And the United States even offered the Soviet Union some Marshall Plan dollars. Of course, they rejected it, saying they didn't need it. But this was an attempt to buttress and stop the spread of communism on its way to the east.